Hey everyone, welcome to this week's Azure update. It's the 7th of March. As always, I have the chapters so you can jump to any particular update you care about the most. Not as always, a new puppy update. I did mention last week that I was a little bit early with the update because I was getting new puppies. And so I thought I would share just a few pictures of the puppies. So this was them on their way home. This was them relaxing in their shirts because it's cold in Idaho, so they need shirts when they go outside, in their ducky pajamas, and then me carrying them outside. And yes, that is my 50th birthday t-shirt my family got me, along with the t-shirt I'm wearing right now because I did turn 50 this week. I'm hoping that old man strength kicks in at any time. On to the normal content. So new videos this week. I created really a deep dive into Azure AI Foundry. Now, I start off with copilots and creating your own copilots, but then Foundry is that pro code hub for everything I'm going to need as that pro code type usage of any type of AI. Yes, generative, but other things as well. And yes, my arms are shredded in the video because the Doberman puppies have razor sharp teeth, and they're trying to test if the death by 1,000 cuts is actually true. We call them the velociraptors. Anyway, on to the what's new. So on the compute side, Azure CNI, so as part of the networking interface, if I'm using Cilium, now has node subnet support in AKS in preview. Now, the node subnet is not something we generally actually want to use. It's more of a legacy model today. It's where every pod gets an IP address from the subnet of the nodes, and therefore has, because it's got a real IP, it has direct connectivity to other pods and services. But the thing here is now it is supported if I'm using the Cilium Azure CNI sort of overlay. And that means it's really got support for all of the different options available. Most of the time these days, you'd want to use the Azure CNI overlay instead, which lets you have a different IP space for the pods from the underlying physical network. But hey, if I'm bound to that node subnet model, now I can still go and use the Azure CNI powered by Cilium. For the Prometheus, where I'm using that scraping to go and get those Prometheus metrics from my AKS cluster, well, obviously, the pods that do the scraping of the Prometheus metrics use up a certain amount of resource. So what now we have is horizontal pod auto scaling. So what this will do is, based on the memory utilization of the pods that are doing that scraping, to go and send it to the AMA metrics, well, that replica set that's being used will now automatically scale from 2 to 12 instances based on the memory being used. So you're not going to have any out of memory type problems. I now can use custom secure boot UEFI keys for my trusted VMs. Now, these are generation 2 virtual machines. It means they use UEFI instead of BIOS. And because it's UEFI, I get virtual TPM. Virtual TPM means I can do things like secure boot. So that attestation from the hardware all the way through to the OS. And that gives me protection from bootkits, rootkits, things trying to get in between that hardware and the operating system. Well, as part of that, there are keys used to sign those various components, the bootloader, the kernel modules. Well, maybe I've got something in my environment where I have to modify elements of that operating system. So now I can use my own secure boot UEFI keys instead of the built-in ones. Now, this is not a typical thing. It's going to be a very, very advanced customer scenario where you are modifying some of those core elements. But if you did have that requirement, hey, you can now do that. Onto storage. So Azure Files Standard now supports a vaulted backup in GA. So there's generally 2 types of backups for a lot of services. One of them is where Azure Backup is really just an orchestrator and signals whatever the service is to do some kind of local snapshot. But that local snapshot is a point in time, but it's stored on the existing storage of whatever that service is. When it's a vaulted backup, it's taking the backup data and actually storing it as part of the recovery services vault. Now, it may not be going to the recovery services vault. It may be like a managed blob, for example. but it's a different location from the underlying storage. And so once I use things like the vaulted backup, I can then leverage features like long-term retention, up to 10 years. I get enhanced backup resiliency features such as multi-user authorization, where one person can't just delete the backup or purge them. I have to have someone else say, yes, you get this permission, so it avoids those bad actor type scenarios. I get regional DR, etc. Azure NetApp Files now has no downtime network feature edit. So the Azure NetApp Files is built on the NetApp filers, but they live in Azure data centers. It provides NFS, SMB, and dual stack file services, and they have various different performance levels. And they had both a basic and a standard networking feature set. The standard networking brought you things like network security groups, user-defined routes, increased IP limits, active-active VPN, express route fastpath. So now I can, for example, change from basic to standard without having to have any downtime in the utilization of my volume. On the database side, we just talked about vaulted backups. So PostgreSQL Flexible also now has vaulted backups. So that same idea, I think it's 5 regions today, but instead of the backup just orchestrating on the in-place location, it will go and take the backup content and store it in another location. Miscellaneous. So confidential ledger now has user-defined functions in preview. So confidential ledger provides me that immutable proof of transactions. It builds on a blockchain. I can't tamper with that. It's tamper evident because of the way it uses a Merkle tree to hash the hashes of each transaction. And then I create these chain of the various blocks. It's very common. Obviously, you've heard of the cryptocurrencies use blockchain. But imagine I wanted immutable proof of my SQL server records. I would take n number of records and create that hash and store it as part of that blockchain. Maybe I have blobs that I need to have a ledger ensuring they've not been tampered with. So all of those things are possible by integrating with the confidential ledger. So what I can now do is write custom business logic. I can use JavaScript, TypeScript that will run within the same trusted execution environment. Remember, that's using things like Intel SGX. So I have that secure enclave where it's actually doing the processing of all of those ledger functions. So now I could have some business logic execute in that same encrypted, protected environment for things happening in the ledger. So for example, as some data is written to the ledger, I could trigger this custom logic I'm writing to maybe go and perform some other function. And they've also lowered the pricing. I think this is basically $3 per day per instance now. So just in terms of using that confidential ledger, it's a cheaper thing to go and on board to. And GPT 4.5 is in preview in Azure AI Foundry. This is the latest GPT model. I think you do have to register today. It supports both text and image modalities. And what seems to be the case for this model is the initial reports seem to suggest the interactions are more natural. It's better able to follow the user intent. And it's obviously great at things like writing, programming, solving problems, etc. And that was it. As always, I hope that was useful. Till next video, take care.